When I first decided to shut down my driveway for renovations, I expected the usual minor inconveniences, having to park on the street for a few days, coordinating with contractors, and maybe dealing with some curious neighbors asking what was going on. What I didn't expect was for Karen, the self-appointed ruler of the HOA, to make it her personal mission to turn a simple home improvement project into a full-blown neighborhood scandal. It all started the morning my contractor arrived, setting up barricades and caution tape to block off the driveway while they worked on resurfacing the pavement. Within minutes, I saw Karen marching down the sidewalk toward my house, her signature look of disapproval already plastered across her face. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice dripping with that condescending tone I had come to despise. "What do you think you're doing?" I sighed, already knowing where this was going, but I turned to face her anyway. "I'm having my driveway redone," I said simply, gesturing to the workers who were already unloading their equipment. Karen folded her arms, her lips pursed as she scanned the scene like a detective looking for violations. "You didn't get approval for this," she snapped. "Blocking off a driveway disrupts the aesthetic of the neighborhood. It's an eyesore." I nearly laughed at the absurdity of the statement. "Karen, this is my property. I don't need approval to resurface my own driveway," she scoffed. "Actually, you do. Any major changes to the exterior of your property require HOA review." "This isn't a major change," I countered. "I'm not adding a new structure, just fixing cracks and resurfacing." But Karen, of course, was not one to let logic stand in the way of her need for control. "It's still disruptive?" she huffed. "What about the neighbors? People rely on seeing a clean, unobstructed driveway as part of the community aesthetic." I stared at her, dumbfounded. "Karen, who on earth relies on seeing my driveway?" She ignored my sarcasm and dramatically looked around, as if expecting an audience to back her up. "And where are you even parking?" she demanded. "On the street?" "Yes," I said flatly. Like every other person with a driveway renovation in the history of civilization, she gasped as if I had just confessed to committing a felony. "You can't just take up street parking. That's for visitors." "Karen," I said, rubbing my temples, "I am a homeowner. I live here. I have the right to park on the street if my driveway is under construction." "We'll see about that," she snapped, spinning on her heel and stomping off. I figured that would be the end of it, just Karen throwing another one of her tantrums. But 20 minutes later, I saw flashing red and blue lights outside my house. Karen had actually called the police. I watched in stunned disbelief as 2 officers stepped out of their patrol car and approached. My contractor, equally confused, looked at me as if to say, "Is this really happening?" I took a deep breath and walked up to meet them. "Afternoon, officers," I said, forcing a polite smile. "Can I help you?" One of them, an older man with a patient but weary expression, nodded. "We received a call about a potential obstruction or hazard on the property." I didn't even need to ask who had called. It was obvious. Sure enough, Karen came striding up behind them, her arms crossed triumphantly. "Yes, that's him," she said, pointing at me like she was identifying a suspect in a lineup. "He's completely blocking off his driveway without proper authorization. This is a safety issue." The younger officer furrowed his brows. "Ma'am, is he blocking the road or just his driveway?" "It's still an obstruction," she argued. "And he's using a public street parking while his driveway is out of commission. That's against the community standards." I let out a slow exhale and turned to the officers. "Look, officers, I'm having my driveway resurfaced. This is a temporary project, completely on my own property, and I have every right to do this. I'm not blocking traffic. I'm not interfering with anyone's property, and street parking is public." The older officer sighed and glanced back at Karen. "Ma'am, unless there's an actual legal violation here, there's nothing we can do." Karen looked appalled. "But this disrupts the neighborhood. He didn't get HOA approval." The officer's patience was clearly wearing thin. "Ma'am, the HOA is not the law. If he's not violating any municipal codes, then this is a civil issue, not a police matter. I saw Karen's face twitch as she realized she wasn't going to get her way. With no real legal grounds, she had wasted everyone's time, including the police's. The officers gave me a polite nod, apologized for the inconvenience, and left. Karen, humiliated and furious, glared at me one last time before storming off. I thought that would be the end of it. I was wrong, because Karen wasn't done yet. If she couldn't get the police to shut down my project, she was going to use the HOA to come after me. And what happened next made my blood boil. If I had thought Karen's involvement would end the moment the police dismissed her complaint, I had grossly underestimated her pettiness. Less than 48 hours after the police left my property, I came home from work to find a large envelope taped to my front door. Its official-looking stamp immediately setting off alarm bells in my head. Tearing it open, I skimmed the first few lines and felt my blood boil. The document was a notice of violation from the HOA, and as I read further, my jaw clenched. According to the letter, I was being fined $500 for obstructing community access and disrupting the neighborhood aesthetic. I had to read it twice just to make sure I wasn't hallucinating. How in the hell was closing my own driveway an obstruction to community access? Was Karen implying that my personal property somehow belonged to the entire neighborhood? And as for aesthetic disruption, I wasn't constructing some monstrous, eyesore-filled addition. I was literally resurfacing a driveway. The real kicker? The fine would double if I didn't comply within 10 days. I took a deep breath, trying to control my rising frustration, and decided to go straight to the source. I pulled out my HOA's bylaws, the very document that outlined the actual rules that homeowners were supposed to follow, and flipped through the pages, scanning for any section that prohibited driveway renovations or required approval. Nothing, not a single line, not a single mention of driveway closures being restricted or subject to prior review. I checked again. Then again, I even scoured the fine print, and it became painfully clear that this so-called violation was nothing more than Karen abusing her HOA connections to punish me for not bowing to her will. This was personal, not procedural. I wasn't about to let Karen and her little HOA cronies get away with this. That same evening, I drafted a formal appeal. I outlined, in excruciating detail, how my renovations did not violate any of the community's actual bylaws. I even attached photos showing that my driveway was contained entirely on my property and that no public pathways or streets had been obstructed in any way. Once my case was airtight, I printed the entire document, along with a copy of the bylaws, and hand-delivered it to the HOA office. I wasn't about to wait weeks for a written response. I demanded a meeting. The HOA meeting. Karen's power play. I knew walking in that this meeting was going to be stacked against me. The HOA was practically Karen's personal kingdom, and most of the board members were either her friends or people too afraid to stand up to her. But I wasn't going in blind. I had facts, proof, and the undeniable truth on my side. The moment I walked into the meeting room, I was greeted by smug faces and fake politeness. Greg, the HOA president, sat at the head of the table, flipping through my appeal like it was some mildly interesting magazine article. Karen, of course, was front and center, her arms crossed and her expression oozing satisfaction. Well, Greg said smoothly, setting my appeal down, we reviewed your case, and while we understand your concerns, the board has unanimously decided to uphold the fine. I scoffed, shaking my head. Based on what? Greg cleared his throat, looking uncomfortably at Karen before replying. While the bylaws don't explicitly mention driveway renovations, the board reserves the right to issue fines for any action that may cause a disruption to the neighborhood. I blinked. Excuse me? Karen leaned forward, smiling sweetly. You see, my name, our guidelines allow us to enforce penalties when a homeowner's actions negatively affect the harmony of the community. Harmony? I repeated, barely able to contain my rage-filled laughter. This isn't about harmony. This is about you being pissed that I didn't roll over when you called the police on me." Greg tensed slightly, but Karen didn't even blink. She was loving every second of this. "This is your decision," I continued, pointing at Karen, "not the HOA's. You filed a personal complaint, and because you run this board like it's your own personal playground, now suddenly I'm getting a fine for something that's not even against the rules." Karen sighed, feigning disappointment. "If you don't like HOA regulations," she said, shrugging, "then perhaps you shouldn't have moved into an HOA community." I clenched my fists, willing myself to stay calm. The HOA's own bylaws contradict what you're doing. You can't just make up rules whenever you feel like it. Greg cleared his throat again, clearly uncomfortable with how much resistance I was putting up. "Look," he said, "you're free to challenge the fine, but while your case is under review, late fees will accrue." Late fees? My eyes narrowed. They were trying to bleed me dry. I sat there for a moment, breathing deeply, calculating my next move. If they wanted to play dirty, fine. I could play dirtier. Time to fight back. When I left that meeting, I didn't just go home and stew in my anger. I got to work. First, I dug deep into my HOA's financial records and past legal disputes. While I couldn't access private financial data, I did find something interesting. Several past homeowners had successfully sued the HOA for wrongful fines and unfair enforcement of policies. That meant my case wasn't unique. Next, I started documenting everything. I took detailed photos and videos of my property, my driveway, and the surrounding area to prove that there was no obstruction whatsoever. Then, I went online and researched local property laws to find out if the HOA even had the legal authority to enforce a fine that wasn't backed by an official bylaw. What I found, they didn't. Not only was my fine unenforceable, but the entire process they used to issue it was illegal under state HOA governance laws. They had zero legal grounds to charge me for a violation that wasn't actually written into the bylaws. And then I found the golden ticket, something that would completely turn the tables on Karen. While researching, I discovered that Karen herself had made several unauthorized modifications to her property, ones that directly violated HOA rules. She had installed an unapproved shed, extended her backyard fencing past community limits, and had even paved over a section of communal green space without approval. In other words, Karen, the person leading the charge against me, was the one breaking actual HOA rules. The ultimate payback. Armed with this evidence, I filed a formal complaint against Karen. But I didn't just submit it quietly. I sent copies of her violations to every single homeowner in the neighborhood. People were furious. Within a week, Karen, who had spent years bullying other homeowners, found herself under fire from the very HOA she controlled. The same board that had blindly followed her lead was now scrambling to distance themselves. The end result, my bogus fine was dropped. Karen was formally reprimanded and forced to pay fines for her own violations. The HOA, afraid of a potential lawsuit, stopped harassing me entirely. And Karen, she lost everything. Her influence in the HOA evaporated overnight. Her power was gone. She tried one last-ditch effort to appeal, but the community had finally turned against her. A few months later, she moved out. And me? I finally got to enjoy my home in peace, knowing that Karen had dug her own grave. By the time my fine was officially revoked, Karen had gone eerily silent. For someone who had spent weeks making my life miserable, I expected her to gloat, argue, or at least pretend that she had some authority left. But no. After the HOA dropped the case against me, after her own violations were exposed to the entire neighborhood, and after she was fined by the very board she once controlled, she seemed to retreat into the shadows. But I wasn't stupid. Karen wasn't done yet. I knew that someone as vindictive as her wouldn't just accept defeat. No, she was undoubtedly plotting something, and I had no intention of giving her the upper hand. That's why, in the weeks that followed, I remained hypervigilant. I kept my security cameras rolling, documenting everything from my property lines to my street parking habits. I also made sure to read every HOA announcement, just in case they tried to pull another stunt. For a while, it seemed like my instincts were wrong. The HOA remained quiet. Karen kept her distance. Too much distance. And then it happened. Karen's final attack. The smear campaign. One morning, I stepped outside to grab my mail and found a bright yellow flyer tucked into my mailbox. My stomach immediately sank because I recognized the passive-aggressive formatting. Karen had been quiet for too long, and now I knew why. The flyer read, "Concerned homeowners, it has come to our attention that certain residents in our beloved community do not respect the values that keep our neighborhood safe, clean, and orderly. We must hold each other accountable. Violators who disrupt the HOA's efforts weaken our community. Selfish homeowners who challenge the HOA are costing you money. The HOA is here to protect us, but bad neighbors are trying to tear it down. Do you want our home values to drop? Do you want anarchy in our streets? Stand with us against those who do not respect our rules. The HOA's leadership has been attacked. We must fight back." I stared at it in disbelief. Karen had gone full propaganda mode. She was actively trying to turn the neighborhood against me, framing me as the villain who had attacked the HOA. It was clear that she had written this nonsense to manipulate the people she still had influence over. But she had miscalculated, because unlike before, this time, the HOA wasn't backing her up. The HOA's betrayal. I wasn't the only one who had received the flyer. Multiple neighbors came to me that same day, showing me identical copies. But instead of siding with Karen, they were furious at her. "This is ridiculous," my next-door neighbor Jim said as he waved the flyer. "She's acting like we live in some dictatorship. She's lost it," another neighbor, Lisa, added. "First, she gets fined for breaking the rules, and now she's playing the victim." What Karen hadn't realized was that, by exposing her own desperation, she had finally tipped the scales against herself. That week, I went to an emergency HOA meeting, and for the first time ever, Karen was on the defensive. I sat in the audience, watching with satisfaction as the very board members who had once sided with her now turned against her. "Karen, this is unacceptable," Greg, the HOA president, said sternly. "You distributed unauthorized flyers filled with misinformation. That is a direct violation of HOA policies." Karen scoffed. "Misinformation? I was raising awareness. You were inciting division." Another board member shot back. I leaned back, enjoying the show. Karen, for the first time, was powerless. She had lost the board support, lost the community's trust, and, best of all, lost control. And then came the final blow. Karen gets removed from the HOA. I hadn't just watched this meeting for entertainment. I had planned for it. After Karen's ranting reached its peak, I stood up and calmly said, "Since we're talking about HOA violations, let's discuss Karen's history of breaking her own rules." The room fell silent. I held up a printed copy of the same complaint I had previously filed against Karen, the one that outlined all of her unapproved property modifications. "The HOA fined me for a violation that didn't even exist," I said. Meanwhile, Karen has been violating actual HOA rules for years. Several board members exchanged nervous glances. "This is old news," Karen sneered, trying to wave me off. "Oh, really?" I smirked. "Then why haven't you corrected your violations?" That's when the board members realized that they had been protecting the wrong person. Greg sighed. "We need to address this properly." The next week, after formal discussions, the board voted to remove Karen from her position. She tried to fight it. She tried every excuse in the book. But this time, she had no allies left. Karen was officially stripped of all HOA authority. The final defeat, Karen moves out. After her removal, Karen became a ghost in the neighborhood. Gone were her daily power trips. No more HOA harassment. No more Karen knocking on doors with complaints. But I wasn't done yet. I decided to go one step further. I went around to my neighbors and rallied support to change the HOA's leadership structure. Less board control over minor homeowner decisions. More transparency on how fines were issued. Stronger protection against HOA abuse. With Karen out of the way, real change actually happened. And Karen, well, after losing all her power, she didn't last long in the neighborhood. Within 3 months, a for sale sign popped up in her yard. And 6 months later, she was gone. No goodbye. No last-minute revenge scheme. Just gone. Peace at last. With Karen finally out of my life, I was finally able to enjoy my home in peace. No more random HOA fines. No more fake complaints. No more petty HOA drama. And every time I walked past her old house, I couldn't help but smile, because in the end, she destroyed herself. All she had to do was mind her own business, but instead, she waged war. And when it was over, she was the only casualty. And I won.